"Get out and stay out," my dad yelled. They threw me out for dropping out of law school. They didn't know I was worth $30 million. Next day, I moved to my Malibu mansion. 3 weeks later, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Have you ever been the one family member who just didn't fit the mold? The air in my father's study was so thick with expensive cigar smoke and silent judgment. You could choke on it. Charles stood there, his back to the massive fireplace, holding the withdrawal papers like they were contaminated evidence. My brother Brandon was pouring himself a glass of scotch, not bothering to offer me one. His smirk, saying everything he was too cowardly to voice. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a failed asset, a line item that wasn't producing the expected return on investment. I didn't cry. Tears are for people who still have hope. I just cataloged the scene. The heavy mahogany desk where I'd spent thousands of hours studying cases I hated. The perfectly aligned books that were never read, only displayed. It wasn't a home. It was a showroom for a life I was now officially fired from living. My life in that Boston townhouse hadn't been a childhood, it had been an internship. While Brandon was groomed for partnership, I was trained for servitude, researching his briefs, organizing his calendar, ghostwriting his law school applications. They called it contributing to the family legacy. I called it what it was, unpaid labor. But they made a critical error in their calculations. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was compliant. They didn't know about the nights, the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. when I wasn't sleeping. But studying forensic accounting, I learned how to track hidden assets, how to spot the tiny, telltale tremors of embezzlement in a ledger. Charles told everyone I was mentally fragile because I refused to follow the script. He painted me as unstable to our entire social circle. A preemptive strike to discredit me if I ever spoke up. It was a brilliant strategy. Really. Gaslighting as reputation management. But he forgot one thing. Survivors don't just survive, we observe. My submission wasn't weakness. It was camouflage. I was gathering data in the dark, building a file on my own family, waiting for the moment the balance sheet would finally tip in my favor. That night, I didn't pack memories. I didn't take the photo albums or the trinkets from family vacations where I'd been asked to take the pictures rather than be in them. I packed efficiency. My laptop, my hard drives, my birth certificate, and the few clothes that didn't look like costumes for a society debutante. It took me 12 minutes to liquidate my life into a single suitcase. I stood in the foyer, looking at the family portrait hanging above the mantel. Everyone was smiling. Except me. I looked tired. For years, I had wondered how they could sleep at night while treating their own flesh and blood like a servant. Tonight, I finally understood the accounting behind it. It's the trap of normalized cruelty. When you treat a person like a commodity for long enough, you stop seeing the human cost. To Charles and Michelle, I wasn't a daughter in pain. I was a depreciating asset that needed to be written off to balance the books. They hadn't kicked me out of hatred. They did it out of corporate restructuring. And that clarity was more valuable than any apology they could have offered. It meant I didn't owe them loyalty. I owed them a severance package. I walked out the front door and down the long, manicured driveway. I didn't look back with longing. I looked back with the cold detachment of an auditor closing a bankrupt file. The house wasn't a home, it was a crime scene of wasted potential. And I was the only witness leaving with the evidence. I checked into a motel near the airport where the carpet smelled of stale cigarettes and bad decisions. I sat on the lumpy mattress and checked my bank balance. $230. That was the sum total of my life's work in their eyes. But I had something else. I opened my laptop. The screen's blue light, illuminating the dark room. I logged into the private server I had built to manage the firm's digital infrastructure. I didn't destroy anything. Destruction is messy and illegal. Instead, I initiated a systems audit freeze. It was a simple command. A digital hiccup that would lock them out of their primary operating accounts for 48 hours. Just a warning shot. A subtle reminder that while they owned the building, I held the keys. Then, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the only thing of sentimental value I had taken. A letter from my grandmother Eleanor. She had slipped it to me years ago. Shortly before she passed. When she first noticed the bruises on my spirit, I unfolded the yellowed paper. My dear Madeline, she had written, I spent my life watching the men in this family trade their souls for status. I stayed silent because I thought I was keeping the peace. But I was just keeping the secrets. Don't make my mistake. Silence isn't a virtue, it's a cage. When the time comes, don't just leave. Rise. I traced her handwriting with my thumb. Eleanor had been the watchman who regretted her shift. She saw the rot in the foundation long before I did. But she felt too old to fight it. She left me this letter not as a goodbye, but as a mandate. I wasn't just saving myself, I was balancing the ledger for her. 2. I folded the letter, placed it next to my laptop, and booked a one-way ticket to California. I had $200, a brilliant mind, and a grandmother's permission to start a war. I didn't see the ocean for the first 2 years. I saw code. I saw the glow of a monitor in a basement apartment that smelled like mildew and ambition. I didn't have a social life. I didn't have a safety net. I had a singular, obsession-fueled directive. Build a weapon. I created Shield Key, a forensic AI designed to do exactly what I had done in my father's study, hunt down internal embezzlement. It was a digital bloodhound, trained to sniff out the creative accounting that men like Charles and Brandon used to hide their sins. While my peers were going to Coachella, I was going to pitch meetings where venture capitalists looked at my cheap suit and assumed I was the assistant. I didn't correct them. I just projected the data. I showed them how my software could catch a rogue CFO in 3 seconds flat. The rejections piled up. But so did the code. I ate ramen not because it was nostalgic, but because it cost 30 cents. I slept on a mattress I pulled out of a dumpster. I became a ghost. Back in Boston, the family narrative was solidifying. Michelle sent me emails. Not to check on me, but to fish for failure. We hope you're managing. She'd write, the subtext dripping with condescension. Your father is willing to discuss a small stipend if you come home and apologize. I never replied. Silence is the loudest noise you can make to a narcissist. They assumed my silence was shame. They assumed I was destitute, lying in a gutter somewhere, learning my lesson. They didn't know that while they were toasting to their own brilliance at the country club, I was signing a Series A term sheet. Then came the due diligence. We were moving toward an acquisition, a massive buyout from a tech giant that wanted my algorithm. Their auditors ran a deep background check on me. I expected it to be clean. It wasn't. The report came back with a red flag, a $50,000 high-interest loan in my name. Defaulted on 3 months ago. I stared at the document, my pulse holding steady. I requested the original paperwork. There it was. My signature, forged with a shaky, arrogant hand. Brandon, he had used my identity to cover a gambling debt, assuming I was too broken and too far away to ever notice. He thought I was a discard pile he could still draw from. I didn't call the police. That would be public. That would be messy. Instead, I quietly paid the debt myself to clear the title on my credit. I didn't scream. I just added the receipt to the file. It wasn't a tragedy, it was leverage. It was the final nail in a coffin he didn't even know he was building. 3 weeks later, I sat in a glass-walled conference room in Palo Alto. I didn't have a lawyer present. I represented myself. I read the contract, clause by clause. Then I picked up a pen and signed away my ownership of Shield Key. I watched the notification hit my phone a few hours later. Wire transfer, received, $65 million. I sat there in the silence of my empty office. I didn't buy champagne. I didn't call a friend. I just closed my eyes and breathed. I was no longer the daughter they had fired. I was the shareholder who just bought the bank. The invitation arrived in a heavy cream envelope. The kind that costs more than most people's groceries for a month. It was embossed with gold leaf. The Blackwood Legacy Gala. Celebrating 40 years of excellence. And beneath that, a handwritten note from Charles, Madeline. We hope you can join us. Let's put the past behind us. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. They didn't want me there because they missed me. They wanted me there because they needed a prop. In their minds, I was still the destitute, failed daughter. By inviting me back into the fold, they could play the magnanimous benefactors, showing their high society friends how generous they were to forgive the black sheep. I was to be their charity case, a living testament to their benevolence. It was a classic arrogance trap. They assumed I was desperate. They assumed I would be grateful for the scraps. I accepted. I didn't rent a helicopter. That would be gauche. It would signal insecurity, a need to prove myself. I didn't need to prove anything. I needed to execute a foreclosure. I flew commercial to Martha's Vineyard, rented a sleek, understated black sedan, and drove to the venue. The gala was being held at a sprawling seaside estate, a monument to excess that perfectly encapsulated everything my family stood for. As I pulled up the long driveway, I saw the valet parking rows of Bentleys and Aston Martins. I handed my keys to the attendant and stepped out. I wasn't wearing a ball gown. I wore a tailored black tuxedo suit, sharp enough to cut glass. It wasn't festive, it was professional. I carried a single, slim leather portfolio. No purse. No clutch. Just the file. Walking toward the entrance, I felt a moment of vertigo. The last time I had been in a room with these people, I was a servant in all but name. The fear tried to creep in. That old childhood instinct to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But then I remembered Eleanor. I remembered the nights in the airport motel. I remembered the forged signature on the loan. If Eleanor hadn't left me that resilience, I thought, I would be walking in here to beg. I would be hoping for a check, for a kind word, for a chance to come home. Instead, I am walking in to foreclose. They think they invited a guest. They invited the auditor. I walked through the double doors into the ballroom. The noise was deafening, crystal clinking. Laughter. The hum of networking. Charles was holding court near the bar, Michelle by his side. Both of them radiating the false warmth of people who believe they are untouchable. Brandon was laughing too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. They looked secure. They looked safe. They had no idea that the floor they were standing on had already been sold out from under them. The ballroom smelled of lilies and old money. Crystal chandeliers cast a prism of light over the crowd, turning the diamonds on the guests' necks into glittering stars. I stood in the shadows of the colonnade, watching. Charles was at the podium, gripping the edges with the confidence of a man who believed his own mythology. He was midway through a speech about integrity and legacy. It was a masterclass in fiction. Building a future isn't just about assets, he said, his voice booming with practiced gravitas. It is about carrying those who cannot carry themselves. We all have burdens, family members who struggle, but we support them. Because that is what the Blackwood name stands for. He paused for effect, looking down at Michelle in the front row. She dabbed at a dry eye with a silk handkerchief, performing the role of the saintly mother. The crowd murmured their approval. They were eating it up, the narrative of the benevolent patriarch supporting his wayward, unstable daughter. It was the perfect spin. He wasn't just lying, he was monetizing my erasure to buy social capital. I stepped out of the shadows. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I walked down the center aisle with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. The sound of my heels on the marble floor cut through the murmur of the crowd. Click, click, click. One by one. Heads turned. The whispers started at the back of the room and rolled forward like a wave. I saw the recognition hit their faces. The cautionary tale had arrived. Wearing a tuxedo that cost more than their centerpieces, Charles saw me. He faltered mid-sentence. For a microsecond, his mask slipped, revealing the panic of a man, realizing the locks he changed weren't enough. But he recovered quickly. He smiled. A tight, predatory grimace. "And here she is," he said into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. "Madeline, we didn't think you were well enough to join us." The trap was set. He was inviting the crowd to pity the crazy daughter. I walked up the stairs to the stage. I stood next to him. I didn't take the microphone. I didn't need it. I placed my leather portfolio on the podium, covering his speech notes. Then, I pulled a small, silver flash drive from my pocket and plugged it into the AV console built into the lectern. "I'm not here to join you, Charles," I said, my voice projecting clearly in the sudden silence. "I'm here to audit you." I hit the enter key. The massive projection screen behind us, which had been displaying a looped slideshow of the Blackwood legacy, flickered. The image of the happy family vanished. In its place, a high-resolution spreadsheet appeared. It was stark. Black text on a white background. The font was large enough for the back row to read. "Let's talk about burdens," I said. I pointed to the first line item highlighted in red. "September 12th, 2015. The day you told everyone I dropped out of law school because I couldn't handle the pressure. The day you claimed you paid $45,000 for my tuition." The crowd leaned in. The silence was absolute. "Data point 1. I continued, gesturing to the screen. "Withdrawal, $45,000. Source, the Eleanor Blackwood Trust, my inheritance. Destination, the Bellagio Casino, Las Vegas. Account holder, Brandon Blackwood." A gasp rippled through the room. I looked at Brandon. He was sitting at the VIP table, his face draining of color, the glass of champagne shaking in his hand. "You didn't pay for my failure, Charles," I said, turning back to my father. "You stole my inheritance to pay for your son's gambling addiction. You framed me to cover a felony." "This is a lie," Charles shouted, trying to cover the microphone. But I had already overridden the audio controls from the laptop. "She's having an episode. Cut the feed." "I'm not done," I said calmly. I clicked the remote. The screen changed. This time, it wasn't just one transaction. It was a waterfall of data. A forensic map of shell companies, offshore accounts, and wire transfers. It was the anatomy of a dying animal. "You speak of legacy," I said, walking the crowd through the numbers. "Here is your legacy. February 4th, you leveraged the Boston townhouse to cover payroll. March 1st, you liquidated your retirement to pay off a blackmail settlement for Brandon. April 15th, you defaulted on the firm's line of credit." I turned to the crowd. "You all think you are sitting at a gala hosted by a tycoon. You are sitting at a wake. The Blackwood Group is insolvent. Their liabilities exceed their assets by $12 million. They didn't invite me here to welcome me back. They invited me here because they needed a scapegoat for the bankruptcy they are about to file." Charles lunged for the laptop. But security hired by the venue, not him, stepped forward, unsure of who was actually in charge. In the confusion, I pulled the final piece of paper from my portfolio. It was a cashier's check. I held it up. The stage lights caught the watermark. "For years, you told me I owed you," I said. You told me I owed you for the roof over my head, for the food on my table, for the burden of my existence. You put a price tag on your love. Charles. So, I'm paying the bill. I slammed the check onto the podium. $45,000. I said, the exact amount you stole. Plus interest. I am buying out my shares in this family. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And in that moment, I saw the mechanism of his destruction. It wasn't the bankruptcy. It wasn't the jail time he would likely face. It was the stripping of the illusion. For men like Charles and women like Michelle, their power doesn't come from who they are, it comes from what they have. They construct an identity out of marble floors and exclusive invitations. They believe their net worth is their self-worth. They look down on the world because they are standing on a pile of money. But when you remove the money, you realize there is no foundation. There is no character. There is no resilience. I watched Charles shrink. Physically. His shoulders slumped. His face went slack. He looked out at the audience, his peers, his investors, his friends, and he saw what I saw. He saw them turning away. He saw the disgust. He saw the social death. The illusion of power had evaporated, leaving behind only a frightened, aging man who had bet everything on a lie and lost. He reached for the check. His hand was shaking. He needed it. He actually needed the money. The realization hit the crowd at the same time it hit him. The great Charles Blackwood was reaching for a handout from the daughter he had exiled. Don't spend it all in one place. I said. I turned my back on him. I didn't look at Michelle, who was frozen in her chair, a statue of ruined elegance. I didn't look at Brandon, who was now weeping into his hands. I walked down the stairs and back up the aisle. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. They didn't touch me. They didn't speak to me. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. I wasn't the crazy daughter anymore. I was the one who held the pen. I walked out the double doors and into the cool night air of Martha's Vineyard. The valet saw me coming and scrambled to get my car. I didn't look back at the venue. I didn't need to see the fallout. I knew the math. The audit was complete. The account was closed. The ocean air in Malibu tastes different than the air in Boston. It doesn't smell like polish or old money, it smells like salt and open space. I sat on the terrace of my estate, watching the Pacific roll in. Rhythmic and endless. There were no time clocks here. No billable hours. No one checking the ledger to see if I was worth the space I occupied. I didn't celebrate the destruction of the Blackwood Group. I didn't throw a party when the foreclosure sign went up on the townhouse lawn, or when Brandon's license was suspended. There is no joy in watching a demolition. There is only the necessary work of clearing the debris so you can build something new. That is the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge looks backward. Justice builds forward. I looked down at the documents on the glass table. The ink was still wet on the charter for the Eleanor Foundation. It wasn't a charity for appearances. It was a legal defense fund for financial abuse victims, a shield for the scapegoats. The black sheep. The children who were told they were burdens while their inheritances were quietly drained. I was taking the weapon Charles had used against me, financial literacy, and handing it to everyone he would have despised. This was the true payout, not the money, but the ability to plant seeds in the ground where my family had only salted the earth. For a long time, I thought my value was something I had to earn. I thought if I worked harder, if I was quieter, if I was more perfect, they would finally see me. But I realized something on that stage in Martha's Vineyard. You cannot force the blind to see the light. You can only stop standing in their shadow. To everyone who has ever felt like a guest in their own home, or an employee in their own family, you are not the problem. You are the solution they were too arrogant to recognize. You are not the failed asset. You are the architect of a life they can't even afford to rent. I closed the laptop. The screen faded to black, reflecting the sunset and the silhouette of a woman who didn't owe anyone a single cent. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, expensive air of freedom. The audit was over. The legacy was mine. If this story reminded you that your value isn't defined by a broken ledger, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're building a new legacy here. Together.